an elderly woman in worn clothes enters an upscale pharmacy chain, seeking medication for her sick granddaughter. The arrogant manager publicly humiliates her when her card is declined, calling security to escort her out while customers watch in shock. The woman remains dignified despite the cruel treatment. What the sneering manager didn't know was that this humble grandmother was Dr. Margaret Chen, retired CEO of the largest pharmaceutical distribution company in the region. And his cruel actions were about to cost his entire chain everything. 1 hour later, a single phone call would shut down every supply line to their stores, leaving shelves empty and his career in ruins. Sometimes the most powerful people are hiding in plain sight. And kindness costs nothing. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Margaret Chen's weathered fingers moved deliberately across the small pile of coins scattered on her kitchen table. The soft clink of metal against wood, the only sound breaking the quiet of her modest apartment. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting gentle shadows across the worn linoleum as she counted each quarter and dime with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of every dollar. Her granddaughter Emma lay sleeping in the small guest bedroom, her 7-year-old face flushed with fever that had persisted through the night, despite Margaret's gentle ministrations with cool cloths and whispered lullabies. The child's parents were halfway across the country attending a work conference, trusting Margaret to care for their precious daughter, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her heart as she listened to Emma's labored breathing through the thin walls. Margaret's simple gray cardigan hung loosely over her shoulders, its edges frayed from years of washing, paired with comfortable walking shoes that had seen countless miles of city sidewalks. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, secured with a simple elastic band, and her face bore the gentle lines of someone who had spent decades caring for others before herself. The prescription bottle on the counter held only 2 pills remaining of Emma's antibiotic, and the pediatrician had been clear that the full course must be completed to prevent the infection from returning. Margaret carefully placed the counted money into her worn leather purse, checking twice to ensure she had enough for the medication, then moved quietly to Emma's bedside. The child stirred slightly as Margaret placed a gentle hand on her forehead, noting with concern that the fever seemed higher than the night before. "Grandma's going to get your medicine, sweetheart," she whispered softly, tucking the blankets more securely around Emma's small frame. "You rest now, and I'll be back soon." Margaret gathered her simple coat and purse, taking one last look at her sleeping granddaughter before stepping into the hallway of the modest apartment building, determined to get the medication that would help Emma recover. Regardless of what challenges lay ahead, Margaret stepped out into the crisp morning air, her worn shoes clicking softly against the sidewalk as she began her journey through the city streets toward Premier Pharmacy. The medication prescription clutched carefully in her coat pocket, alongside her modest collection of bills and coins. The walk took her past 3 smaller neighborhood pharmacies, each one calling to her with their familiar, welcoming storefronts and reasonable prices. But the pediatrician had been specific about the antibiotic Emma needed, explaining that only the larger chain stores carried this particular formulation that was crucial for fighting her granddaughter's persistent infection. Margaret paused briefly outside Murphy's Corner Pharmacy, where old Mr. Murphy himself often worked behind the counter and knew every customer by name. But she knew from previous experience that they wouldn't have what Emma needed, and there was no time to waste calling around to different locations. The morning crowd moved past her as she continued her determined walk. Business people in tailored suits rushing toward their offices, joggers in expensive athletic wear heading to the park, and mothers pushing strollers that likely cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. As Premier Pharmacy came into view, its gleaming glass facade and bold signage declaring it the city's premier destination for health and wellness, Margaret felt a small knot of apprehension form in her stomach, not from fear, but from the stark awareness of how different she looked from the usual clientele of such an establishment. The building rose before her like a monument to modern commerce, its spotless windows reflecting the morning sun and displaying advertisements for luxury skincare products and premium vitamins that cost more than some people's weekly paychecks. Margaret smoothed her cardigan self-consciously and checked once more that her purse was securely closed. Then pushed through the heavy glass doors into an interior that seemed to sparkle with polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and displays that looked more like jewelry cases than medicine shelves. The contrast between her simple, practical clothing and the store's opulent atmosphere was immediately apparent. But Margaret held her head high with quiet dignity, reminding herself that she had every right to be there, that Emma's health was worth far more than any judgment others might pass based on appearances alone. David Morrison emerged from his corner office like a peacock displaying its plumage, his perfectly tailored charcoal suit crisp and unwrinkled, his signature burgundy tie knotted with mathematical precision, and his Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected the store's expensive lighting fixtures. His dark hair was slicked back with expensive pomade, not a strand out of place, and his manicured fingernails gleamed as he adjusted his gold cufflinks while surveying his domain with the self-satisfied air of someone who believed his position made him superior to those around him. The moment his calculating eyes fell upon Margaret at the prescription counter, his expression shifted from professional pleasantness to barely concealed disdain, his lip curling slightly as he took in her simple cardigan, worn shoes, and the way she carefully handled her modest purse. Morrison sidled up to his assistant manager, a nervous young man named Trevor, who had learned to anticipate his boss's moods, and spoke in a voice just loud enough to be overheard by nearby customers, his tone dripping with condescension and theatrical concern. "Trevor, I thought we discussed maintaining our store's reputation and clientele standards," he said, straightening his tie with a deliberate gesture while his eyes remained fixed on Margaret, who was patiently waiting as Jessica processed her prescription. "We need to be careful about certain types of customers who might not understand our pricing structure or appreciate the quality of service we provide to our preferred clients." His voice carried the unmistakable implication that Margaret didn't belong among the well-dressed shoppers browsing the luxury skincare section, and Trevor shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the cruel undertone in his superior's words. Morrison adjusted his suit jacket with practiced arrogance, his entire demeanor radiating the kind of shallow superiority that came from judging worth by appearances alone, completely oblivious to the fact that his expensive clothing and polished exterior masked a character far less valuable than the humble woman he was so eager to dismiss. "Keep an eye on this situation," he murmured to Trevor, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been challenged on his prejudices. "Some people need to learn that Premier Pharmacy caters to a certain class of clientele." The soft electronic beep of the card reader seemed to echo through the pristine pharmacy as Jessica's face fell with genuine concern, her young features reflecting the awkwardness of having to deliver unwelcome news to someone she had been treating with such kindness. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen, but your card seems to have been declined," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced nervously toward where Morrison stood watching the interaction with predatory interest. Margaret felt a flutter of embarrassment, but maintained her composure, her weathered hands steady as she reached back into her worn leather purse, knowing that sometimes her old bank card had issues with the newer electronic systems that these upscale stores used. "That's quite all right, dear," she replied with gentle dignity, her voice calm and reassuring despite the mounting tension she could feel from Morrison's direction. "Perhaps we could try it once more, or I have cash and another card if needed." Before Jessica could respond or attempt another transaction, Morrison swooped in like a hawk, spotting vulnerable prey, his polished shoes clicking authoritatively against the marble floor, as he positioned himself between Margaret and the counter with theatrical aggression. "What exactly is going on here?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of other customers who turned to stare at the unfolding scene, his perfectly groomed exterior barely containing his obvious suspicion and disdain. "Ma'am, are you attempting to use fraudulent payment methods in my establishment?" he continued, his tone accusatory and designed to humiliate, completely ignoring Jessica's attempts to explain that it was simply a declined card, a common occurrence that happened to customers regardless of their financial status. Margaret looked up at Morrison with steady eyes, recognizing immediately the type of man who wielded his small authority like a weapon against those he perceived as beneath his station, but she refused to be cowed by his aggressive posturing or intimidated by his expensive suit and condescending manner. "Sir, I simply need to try another payment method," she said with quiet firmness, her dignity intact despite his obvious attempts to embarrass her in front of the growing audience of curious onlookers. "This medication is for my sick granddaughter, and I assure you I have the means to pay for it." Morrison's voice rose with theatrical authority as he positioned himself to ensure maximum visibility to the growing crowd of customers who had stopped their shopping to witness the unfolding spectacle, his polished demeanor transforming into something cruel and calculating as he sensed an opportunity to assert his power over someone he deemed defenseless. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the type of establishment this is," he declared with exaggerated patience, gesturing broadly at the luxury displays and expensive fixtures surrounding them, his words dripping with condescension designed to strip away Margaret's dignity in the most public way possible. Premier Pharmacy serves a very specific clientele with particular expectations and standards, and perhaps you would be more comfortable at one of the discount chains across town that cater to customers with more modest means and limited budgets. The carefully chosen words hit their mark as intended, causing several well-dressed customers to pause their conversations and stare openly at Margaret, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition that they were witnessing something profoundly unkind. Morrison continued his performance with increasing confidence, straightening his burgundy tie like a badge of authority, while his voice carried across the marble floors and crystal fixtures, ensuring that everyone within earshot understood exactly what kind of person he believed Margaret to be. "I'm sure there are establishments more suited to your particular circumstances, where you might find the prices more manageable and the atmosphere less overwhelming," he said, his smile never reaching his cold eyes as he gestured dismissively toward the door, clearly expecting Margaret to flee in shame from his public dressing down. Throughout this humiliating ordeal, Margaret stood perfectly still, with her hands folded gently over her worn purse and her back straight, and her expression serene, despite the cruel words washing over her like a tide designed to sweep away her self-worth. She met Morrison's gaze with quiet strength, her weathered face reflecting decades of facing far greater challenges than a small man drunk on tiny power. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable dignity of someone who knew her true worth had nothing to do with the opinions of those who judged by appearances alone. "Young man, I simply need medication for my sick granddaughter, and I believe that compassion and basic human decency should be available at any price point." Morrison's face flushed with indignation as he realized that Margaret was not cowering or retreating as he had expected. And with theatrical outrage, he reached for the phone behind the prescription counter, while addressing the growing crowd of onlookers with the practiced authority of someone who had never been challenged on his cruelty. "This customer is clearly causing a disturbance and disrupting the shopping experience for our valued clientele," he announced loudly, his voice echoing off the polished surfaces as he dialed the security office with deliberate showmanship, ensuring that every person in the store understood that he was the one in control of this situation. "Security, please come to the main pharmacy counter immediately. We have someone here who is wasting everyone's time and refusing to accept that her payment methods are not suitable for our establishment." Jessica stepped forward with admirable courage, despite her obvious fear of Morrison's retribution. Her young face flushed with anger at the injustice she was witnessing, and she addressed her manager with a trembling but determined voice. "Mr. Morrison, this lady has been nothing but polite and patient, and declined cards happen all the time. There's absolutely no reason to involve security or treat her this way," she said, her professional training warring with her basic human decency, as she tried to defend Margaret from the escalating humiliation. Morrison whirled on Jessica with fury that seemed disproportionate to her mild defense, his perfectly groomed appearance unable to mask the ugliness of his character as he pointed an accusatory finger at his young employee. "Miss Patterson, you will not question my decisions or undermine my authority in front of customers, and if you continue this insubordination, you can join her outside looking for employment elsewhere," he snapped, his threat hanging heavy in the air as two security guards approached the scene with obvious reluctance. Margaret watched this exchange with growing sadness, not for herself but for the young pharmacist whose kindness was being punished, and for Morrison himself, who seemed completely unaware of how his actions reflected on his character. When the security guards arrived, she gathered her dignity around herself like armor and addressed them with quiet grace before they could speak. "Gentlemen, I understand that I'm being asked to leave, and I will go peacefully. But I want you to know that I came here only to get medicine for my sick granddaughter, and I have been treated with unprecedented cruelty for no reason other than my appearance." With her head held high, Margaret walked slowly toward the exit, her worn shoes clicking softly against the marble floor as Morrison watched with satisfaction, completely unaware that he had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. Margaret settled into the driver's seat of her modest sedan parked across the street from Premier Pharmacy, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear or humiliation but from the controlled anger of someone who had witnessed unnecessary cruelty and possessed the power to address it. She sat quietly for several moments, collecting her thoughts while watching the gleaming storefront where Morrison was likely congratulating himself on maintaining his precious standards, completely oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed through his callous treatment of what he assumed was a powerless elderly woman. From her worn leather purse, Margaret retrieved a sleek smartphone that seemed oddly sophisticated for someone of her humble appearance, and with practiced ease, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed, her finger hovering momentarily over a name that represented decades of professional relationships and mutual respect. "Sarah." "It's Margaret Chen," she said when the call connected, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had once commanded boardrooms and million-dollar decisions, though now she spoke with the measured tone of someone who had learned that true power lay in knowing when and how to use it. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning, but I need to discuss an urgent matter regarding one of our distribution contracts with Premier Pharmacy chain." On the other end of the line, Sarah Martinez, now the head of Chen Distribution Network and Margaret's former protégé, immediately recognized the subtle shift in her former mentor's voice that indicated this was not a social call, but a matter requiring immediate attention and decisive action. Margaret calmly recounted the events that had just transpired, describing Morrison's behavior with clinical precision while avoiding emotional language, painting a clear picture of systematic discrimination and cruelty that violated every principle upon which she had built her company's reputation for ethical business practices. "Sarah, I want you to understand that this isn't about personal revenge or wounded pride," Margaret continued, her eyes fixed on the pharmacy's entrance where unsuspecting customers continued their shopping, unaware of the character of the man who managed their trusted healthcare provider. "This is about a pattern of behavior that suggests Premier Pharmacy's management doesn't align with our company values regarding dignity, respect, and equal access to healthcare services." The conversation that followed would change everything for Morrison and his store, though he remained blissfully unaware that his victim was orchestrating his downfall with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout his public assault on her character. Morrison strode back into the store with the swagger of someone who believed he had just performed a public service, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with renewed confidence as he surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a general who had successfully defended his territory from unwanted invaders. The other customers had gradually returned to their shopping, though several continued to cast uncomfortable glances in his direction, unsure whether they had witnessed necessary store management or something far more troubling. But Morrison interpreted their attention as admiration for his decisive leadership and firm adherence to standards. "Trevor, gather the staff for a brief meeting," he announced loudly, ensuring that his voice carried across the prescription area where Jessica continued to process other customers with obvious reluctance, her young face still flushed with anger and disappointment at what she had been forced to witness. Within minutes, the small group of employees had assembled near the pharmacy counter, their expressions ranging from nervous compliance to barely concealed disgust, as Morrison began what he clearly considered a teaching moment about proper customer management and maintaining the store's prestigious reputation. "What you just witnessed was exactly how we handle situations where individuals attempt to take advantage of our establishment," he declared with theatrical authority, straightening his burgundy tie like a badge of honor, while his eyes swept across his staff with the expectation of unanimous approval. Premier Pharmacy has built its reputation on serving a discerning clientele who appreciate quality, service, and appropriate standards. And we cannot allow that reputation to be compromised by people who clearly belong elsewhere. Jessica's hands clenched into fists at her sides as she listened to Morrison's self-congratulatory speech, her professional training warring with her basic human decency as she struggled to remain silent in the face of such callous justification for cruelty. When Morrison noticed her obvious disapproval, his demeanor shifted from triumphant to threatening, and he stepped closer to her with the predatory instinct of someone who enjoyed wielding power over those he perceived as vulnerable. "Miss Patterson, your body language suggests you have some objection to my management decisions," he said with dangerous quiet, his voice carrying the unmistakable threat of someone who had never been challenged successfully. "Let me be absolutely clear about your position here. You are a replaceable employee in a competitive job market. And if you cannot support the standards and decisions that keep this establishment profitable and prestigious, then perhaps you should consider whether this is the right workplace for your particular sensibilities." The threat hung in the air like poison. But Jessica met his gaze with quiet courage, knowing that some things were more important than job security. Exactly 1 hour after Margaret's quiet phone call from her car, Morrison was reviewing inventory reports in his office when Trevor knocked hesitantly on the door, his nervous expression suggesting that something was amiss with the day's normally smooth operations. "Morrison, the 10 o'clock delivery from Chen Distribution hasn't arrived yet, and it's unusual because they're always punctual, sometimes even early," Trevor reported, glancing at his clipboard with the kind of anxiety that came from working under someone who blamed subordinates for problems beyond their control. Morrison barely looked up from his paperwork, waving dismissively as he continued to bask in the afterglow of what he considered his masterful handling of the morning's unpleasant situation with the inappropriate customer who had dared to challenge his authority. "Traffic, construction, mechanical problems. Trevor, these things happen all the time in delivery services, and I'm sure they'll be here within the hour," he replied with the confidence of someone who had never experienced a serious disruption to his carefully ordered world. But as the minutes ticked by and turned into another hour, Morrison's phone began ringing with increasing frequency, each call bringing news that seemed increasingly impossible and yet undeniably real. First, it was Chen Distribution calling to inform him that there were system issues affecting their delivery schedules and that all shipments to Premier Pharmacy locations would be delayed indefinitely, pending a comprehensive review of their service agreements. Then Apex Medical Supply called with a nearly identical message, followed by Cardinal Health, and finally MedSource Solutions, each representative using remarkably similar language about contract reviews and system evaluations that would temporarily suspend all deliveries to Premier Pharmacy chains while they conducted internal assessments of their client relationships. Morrison's confident dismissal turned to confusion, then to growing alarm as he realized that every major pharmaceutical supplier in the region seemed to be experiencing simultaneous problems that affected only his stores, while other pharmacies in the city reported no disruptions whatsoever to their supply chains. "This is impossible," he muttered to himself as he frantically dialed supplier after supplier, only to receive polite but firm responses about temporary service suspensions and the need for comprehensive reviews of business relationships. Trevor stood in the doorway watching his boss's growing panic with a mixture of concern and secret satisfaction, remembering the cruel way Morrison had treated the elderly woman just hours earlier, though he couldn't possibly imagine any connection between that incident and the mysterious collapse of their entire supply network. Morrison's hands trembled as he set down the phone after his 7th consecutive call to suppliers, each conversation ending with the same impossible result. Every major pharmaceutical distributor in the region had simultaneously decided to suspend deliveries to Premier Pharmacy while maintaining normal service to every other pharmacy chain in the city. The impossible nature of the situation began to sink in as he frantically searched online pharmacy forums and trade websites, discovering that competitors across town were posting about normal delivery schedules and full inventory levels, while his own stores faced the prospect of empty shelves within days. His computer screen displayed a growing list of supplier contacts, each one crossed out as he worked his way through every possible vendor, only to hear variations of the same polite but firm message about contract reviews and service suspensions that defied all logic and business sense. The shrill ring of his office phone made him jump, and when he saw the caller ID displaying his regional manager's number, Morrison felt his stomach drop with the sickening realization that news of his supply problems had already reached corporate headquarters. "Morrison, what in God's name is happening down there?" barked Regional Manager Patricia Hawkins, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that preceded major career upheavals and termination meetings. "I've got reports from 4 different suppliers claiming they're suspending service to your entire district, and when I called them directly, they cited concerns about business practices and company alignment that make absolutely no sense." Morrison struggled to find words that would explain the inexplicable, his mind racing through every possible cause while his voice cracked with desperation as he tried to maintain some semblance of professional competence. "Patricia, I honestly don't understand what's happening. These suppliers have been reliable partners for years, and there's been no change in our payment schedules or contract terms," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool temperature of his air-conditioned office. The regional manager's response was swift and unforgiving, her years of corporate experience telling her that when multiple business relationships collapsed simultaneously, there was always a specific cause that someone was either hiding or too incompetent to identify. "Morrison, I don't care if you have to call every pharmaceutical executive in the country. You will find out what caused this situation and you will fix it immediately. Because if Premier Pharmacy loses market share due to empty shelves, the corporate office will be looking for someone to hold responsible." As the call ended with a slam that echoed through his office, Morrison stared at his reflection in the dark computer screen, finally beginning to understand that his carefully constructed world of authority and control was crumbling around him for reasons he couldn't begin to comprehend. Margaret pushed through the heavy glass doors of Premier Pharmacy for the second time that day, her worn shoes clicking softly against the familiar marble floors as she observed the subtle but unmistakable signs of chaos that had begun to infiltrate the store's usually pristine atmosphere. Behind the prescription counter, she could see Morrison hunched over his phone with obvious desperation, his perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled and his signature burgundy tie loosened at the neck as he gestured frantically while speaking to someone who was clearly not giving him the answers he desperately needed. The other staff members moved with nervous energy, their usual confident demeanor replaced by worried glances and hushed conversations about delivery schedules and inventory concerns that seemed to have materialized from nowhere during what should have been a routine business day. Jessica looked up from her computer terminal and recognized Margaret immediately, her young face lighting up with surprise and genuine concern as she remembered the cruel treatment her customer had endured just hours earlier at the hands of her increasingly frantic manager. "Chen, I'm so sorry about what happened this morning," Jessica whispered urgently, glancing nervously toward Morrison's office where heated phone conversations continued to punctuate the store's atmosphere with growing tension. "I tried to help, but he threatened my job, and I hope you were able to get your granddaughter's medication somewhere else." Margaret smiled gently at the young pharmacist, recognizing the courage it had taken for Jessica to defend a stranger against her superior's cruelty, and she spoke with the kind of warmth that immediately put the worried employee at ease. "Thank you for your kindness, dear. It meant more than you know," Margaret replied softly, her eyes twinkling with something that Jessica couldn't quite identify as she continued. "Actually, I was hoping to speak with Mr. Morrison about my experience here this morning, as I believe there are some important things he should understand about customer service and treating people with basic human dignity." Jessica's eyes widened with alarm as she realized that Margaret intended to confront Morrison directly, and she glanced nervously toward his office where the manager's voice had risen to near shouting levels as he apparently received another rejection from yet another supplier. "Mrs. Chen, he's been in a terrible mood all afternoon because of some supply problems, and I'm worried he might be even ruder than he was this morning," Jessica warned. But Margaret's expression remained serene as she approached the prescription counter with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret approached Morrison's office with measured steps, her presence drawing his attention away from yet another frantic phone call as she stood quietly in the doorway, waiting with infinite patience for him to acknowledge her return to the store he had ejected her from with such theatrical cruelty just hours earlier. Morrison looked up with irritation flashing across his features, clearly expecting to dismiss another unwelcome interruption to his increasingly desperate attempts to salvage his supply chain disaster. But his expression shifted to confusion and then alarm as he recognized the humble woman he had humiliated in front of his customers and staff. "Excuse me, but I believe I made it clear this morning that you needed to find another pharmacy more suited to your circumstances," he said with diminished authority, his voice lacking the confident cruelty he had displayed earlier, as the weight of his supply problems had stripped away much of his theatrical arrogance. Margaret stepped into his office with calm dignity, closing the door gently behind her as she observed the chaos of papers, phone lists, and empty coffee cups that had accumulated during his afternoon of desperation. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to fill the small space with undeniable presence. "Mr. Morrison, I don't believe we were properly introduced this morning during our unfortunate encounter," she began, her weathered hands folded peacefully in front of her, as she met his increasingly nervous gaze with steady composure. "My name is Dr. Margaret Chen, and until my retirement 5 years ago, I served as the Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board for Chen Distribution Network, the largest pharmaceutical supply company in this region." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow, his face draining of all color, as the impossible connection between his morning's cruelty and his afternoon's catastrophe suddenly became crystal clear, and he felt his legs grow weak as he realized that the humble woman he had publicly humiliated and ejected was the former head of the very company that controlled his store's survival. "That's impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible as he stared at Margaret's simple cardigan and worn shoes, his mind struggling to reconcile her modest appearance with the terrifying reality of what her identity meant for his career and his store's future. Margaret regarded him with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout his cruel performance that morning. And when she spoke again, her words carried the unmistakable weight of absolute truth. "Mr. Morrison, I remain on the board of directors and maintain significant influence over company policies regarding which businesses align with our values of dignity, respect, and equal access to healthcare services." Margaret settled into the chair across from Morrison's desk with the quiet grace of someone who had occupied countless boardrooms and executive offices throughout her distinguished career, her presence transforming the cramped space from a place of authority into something that felt more like a classroom where important lessons were about to be taught. "You see, Mr. Morrison, when I founded Chen Distribution Network 35 years ago, it was built on a fundamental principle that healthcare should be accessible to everyone regardless of their appearance, economic status, or social position," she began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Even in retirement, I remain actively involved as Chairman Emeritus of the Board of Directors, and I still have considerable influence over our company's policies regarding which businesses we choose to partner with and support through our distribution services." Morrison sat frozen behind his desk, his expensive suit now feeling like a costume that couldn't hide the growing terror in his eyes, as he began to understand the full scope of his morning's catastrophic mistake. And Margaret continued with the same calm authority that had once commanded respect in corporate meetings and industry conferences. "Our company has always maintained strict standards for business partners, requiring that they demonstrate commitment to serving all members of their community with dignity and respect, particularly vulnerable populations like the elderly, disabled, and economically disadvantaged, who often face discrimination in healthcare settings." She paused to let her words sink in, watching as Morrison's face grew increasingly pale while he grasped the implications of his behavior being evaluated by the very company that controlled his store's ability to function. "This morning, I witnessed firsthand how you treat customers who don't meet your superficial standards of appearance or perceived wealth, and your actions represent exactly the kind of systematic discrimination that my company was founded to oppose and eliminate from healthcare access." Margaret's voice remained steady and professional, But there was an unmistakable steel beneath her gentle exterior as she continued. "When you publicly humiliated me, called security to have me removed, and suggested I shop at discount stores more suited to my budget, you weren't just being cruel to one elderly woman. You were demonstrating a pattern of behavior that violates every principle Chen Distribution Network stands for, in our mission to ensure that quality healthcare remains accessible to all people." Morrison tried to speak, but no words came out as he realized that his arrogance and prejudice had led him to attack the very person whose company's values he had spent his career violating through his treatment of vulnerable customers. Morrison's professional facade crumbled completely as the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him, and he leaped from his chair with the desperate energy of someone whose entire world was collapsing in real time, his hands shaking as he attempted to salvage his career through increasingly frantic gestures of contrition and damage control. "Dr. Chen, please. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea who you were. And if I had known your position, I never would have treated you with anything less than the utmost respect and courtesy," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic as he moved around his desk toward her with the supplicating posture of someone begging for mercy. "Please allow me to personally ensure that your granddaughter receives her medication immediately, completely free of charge, and I'll arrange for our premium delivery service to bring it directly to your home along with any other medications she might need in the future." Margaret remained seated with perfect composure, her hands folded peacefully in her lap as she watched Morrison's desperate performance with the calm observation of someone who had witnessed countless executives attempt to talk their way out of the consequences of their poor decisions. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to provide written policies guaranteeing that every customer who enters this store will be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance, payment method, or perceived social status," he continued frantically, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning as he paced back and forth across his small office. "I'll personally train every staff member on respectful customer service, and I'll establish a fund to help customers who have difficulty paying for their medications. Anything you think would demonstrate our commitment to the values your company represents." Margaret listened to his desperate litany of promises with the patient attention of someone who understood that true change came from character, not from panic-driven policy adjustments. And when he finally paused to catch his breath, she spoke with gentle but unwavering firmness. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate that you're concerned about the consequences of your actions, but what troubles me most is that your apologies and promises are motivated entirely by fear for your career rather than genuine remorse for the cruelty you displayed towards someone you believed was powerless to defend herself." Her words cut through his desperation like a blade, forcing him to confront the ugly truth that his regret was purely self-serving, and she continued with the measured wisdom of someone who had learned that actions reveal character far more clearly than words ever could. "The fact that you would treat any customer with such contempt, simply because they didn't meet your superficial standards, tells me everything I need to know about your values and your fitness to serve vulnerable people who depend on healthcare access." As Morrison's desperate pleas echoed through his office, Jessica appeared in the doorway with a courage that seemed to have been building throughout the day, her young face set with determination as she took a deep breath and stepped forward to address both Margaret and her increasingly panicked manager. "Chen, I think you should know that what happened to you this morning wasn't an isolated incident," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word as she finally found the opportunity to speak truth to power without fear of immediate retaliation. "I've filed complaints with corporate human resources 3 separate times about Mr. Morrison's treatment of elderly customers, disabled customers, and anyone he deemed unworthy of shopping here, based purely on their appearance or payment difficulties." Morrison whirled toward Jessica with fury and desperation. But before he could silence her, other staff members began gathering in the office doorway, drawn by the unprecedented opportunity to finally share their own experiences of witnessing systematic cruelty under his management. Trevor stepped forward with uncharacteristic boldness, his nervous demeanor replaced by righteous anger as he addressed Margaret directly. Last month, he had security escort out an elderly veteran who was trying to use his prescription assistance card, claiming the man was trying to defraud the system, And when I tried to help process the legitimate benefits, Morrison threatened to write me up for insubordination. Sarah from the cosmetics counter joined the growing group, her voice shaking with emotion as she recounted her own painful memories. He regularly makes humiliating comments about customers who ask about generic medications or use manufacturer coupons, calling them cheapskates and suggesting they shop elsewhere if they can't afford our premium prices. One by one, the staff members who had been silenced by fear and threats began sharing their stories of Morrison's systematic pattern of cruelty toward vulnerable customers, painting a picture of deliberate discrimination that had poisoned the store's atmosphere for months. Margaret listened to each account with growing sadness, not just for the customers who had been mistreated, but for the young employees who had been forced to participate in or witness such cruelty while fearing for their own livelihoods. He told Mrs. Rodriguez that people like her should stick to community health centers when her insurance didn't cover the full cost of her diabetes medication. Jessica continued, her voice breaking with emotion as she remembered the elderly woman's tears. Morrison stood frozen in the center of his office, surrounded by his own staff's testimony against him, finally understanding that his reign of petty tyranny had been carefully documented by the very people he had bullied into silence, and that his morning's encounter with Margaret had simply been the catalyst that allowed their voices to finally be heard. The glass doors of Premier Pharmacy opened with authoritative purpose as three impeccably dressed corporate executives strode into the store, with the focused determination of people who had traveled across the city to handle a crisis that threatened their company's most crucial business relationships and fundamental reputation. Leading the group was Patricia Hawkins, the regional manager whose earlier phone call had barely scratched the surface of the catastrophe that had unfolded, followed by Senior Vice President Michael Crawford and Corporate Ethics Director Linda Martinez, their expressions reflecting the gravity of a situation that had escalated from supply chain disruption to potential corporate scandal within a matter of hours. Morrison emerged from his office like a condemned man walking to his execution, his earlier desperation now replaced by the hollow resignation of someone who had finally grasped that no amount of pleading or promising could undo the damage he had inflicted on both his company's reputation and his own career, through his systematic cruelty and breathtaking poor judgment. Mr. Morrison, we've spent the past 2 hours in emergency meetings with Chen Distribution Network's board of directors, and what we've learned about your management practices and customer treatment policies represents a fundamental violation of everything our company claims to stand for, Patricia announced with clinical precision, her voice carrying the weight of corporate authority as she gestured toward Margaret with obvious respect and recognition. Dr. Chen has graciously agreed to meet with us despite the appalling treatment she received at your hands, and her staff members have provided detailed accounts of a pattern of discriminatory behavior that could have resulted in civil rights violations and massive liability for our entire corporation. Michael Crawford stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing documents that would reshape Morrison's future, his voice carrying the finality of decisions that had already been made in boardrooms far above Morrison's pay grade. Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as store manager, and security will escort you from the premises once you've cleared out your personal belongings under supervision. Linda Martinez addressed the gathered staff members who had found the courage to speak truth to power, her warm tone a stark contrast to the cold efficiency with which Morrison's career was being dismantled. To those of you who tried to report these issues through proper channels, we apologize that your concerns weren't addressed appropriately, and we're implementing immediate policy changes that will ensure every customer receives dignified, respectful service regardless of their appearance, payment method, or perceived economic status. Margaret watched this corporate reckoning with quiet satisfaction, not for Morrison's downfall but for the systemic changes that would protect future vulnerable customers from experiencing the humiliation and cruelty she had endured that morning. 6 months after the day that changed everything at Premier Pharmacy, Margaret pushed through the familiar glass doors, carrying a prescription for Emma's routine checkup, but the atmosphere that greeted her was transformed beyond recognition from the cold, judgmental environment that had once made vulnerable customers feel unwelcome and ashamed. The marble floors still gleamed, and the crystal fixtures still sparkled. But the store now radiated warmth and genuine hospitality, under the leadership of new manager Rebecca Torres, a compassionate healthcare professional who had implemented revolutionary policies that treated every customer with dignity regardless of their appearance, payment method, or economic circumstances. Jessica, now promoted to head pharmacist, looked up from her station with a genuine smile that reflected the job satisfaction of someone who could finally practice her profession according to her values rather than the cruel directives of a discriminatory supervisor. "Good morning, Dr. Chen. How is Emma doing with her new school year?" Jessica asked warmly, her greeting reflecting the kind of personal attention that had become standard practice for all customers. From the wealthy executives in expensive suits to the elderly pensioners counting coins for their medications. Throughout the store, Margaret observed the subtle but profound changes that had transformed Premier Pharmacy from a monument to superficial judgment into a true healthcare sanctuary where a disabled veteran could use his assistance benefits without scrutiny, where an elderly woman speaking broken English received patient translation help, and where teenage mothers could access contraception without facing moral lectures or financial shaming. The walls now displayed information about prescription assistance programs, sliding scale payment options, and community health resources, while trained staff members had learned to approach payment difficulties with solutions rather than suspicion. Understanding that healthcare access was a fundamental human right, rather than a privilege reserved for the wealthy, Margaret noticed how other customers moved through the store with relaxed confidence, knowing they would be treated with respect whether they were purchasing expensive supplements or seeking help with insurance complications, and she felt deep satisfaction in witnessing how corporate accountability and ethical leadership had created an environment where Morrison's culture of cruelty had been replaced by genuine care and professional service. As she completed her transaction with ease and courtesy, Margaret reflected on how this single store had become a model for the entire chain, proving that profitability and compassion were not mutually exclusive, and that treating all people with dignity actually enhanced rather than diminished the customer experience for everyone who walked through those gleaming glass doors. On a crisp Saturday morning in the community health center located in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods, Margaret and Emma worked side by side organizing prescription assistance paperwork and helping elderly patients navigate the complex world of insurance forms and medication benefits, their shared volunteer work having become a cherished weekly tradition that strengthened their bond while serving those who needed advocacy most. Emma, now a healthy and spirited 8-year-old, had developed a remarkable ability to connect with elderly patients, her natural empathy and patience, making her an invaluable assistant as she helped translate instructions for Spanish-speaking clients and entertained anxious children while their grandparents waited for consultations. Margaret watched with pride as her granddaughter demonstrated the kind of compassion and service that had become the foundation of their family's values, knowing that these experiences were teaching Emma lessons about dignity, respect, and social responsibility that no classroom could provide. Across town, in a modest community pharmacy that served the city's most vulnerable populations, David Morrison emerged from the back room carrying a tray of sorted medications, his expensive suits and arrogant demeanor long since replaced by simple scrubs and a humility that had been earned through months of genuine self-reflection and dedicated service to those he had once dismissed as unworthy of his attention. The transformation in Morrison had been gradual but profound, beginning with his termination and continuing through a period of unemployment that had forced him to confront the ugliness of his character and the pain he had inflicted on vulnerable people who had simply needed healthcare access and basic human decency. Working under the supervision of Dr. Patricia Vasquez, a compassionate physician who specialized in serving undocumented immigrants, elderly patients on fixed incomes, and families struggling with medical debt, Morrison had slowly learned to find purpose and satisfaction in helping rather than humiliating those who needed assistance most. His days were now filled with patient education sessions, where he explained medication instructions to elderly patients with infinite patience, financial counseling where he helped families navigate prescription assistance programs, and community outreach where he visited homebound patients who couldn't travel to the pharmacy for their essential medications. The man who had once threatened to call security on Margaret for having a declined credit card now spent his lunch breaks delivering free medications to disabled veterans and his evenings translating prescription labels into multiple languages for immigrant families who trusted him with their most precious asset, their health, and the health of their children. As Margaret reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed not just one pharmacy but an entire approach to healthcare service, she understood that the most powerful lesson was not about hidden identity or delayed justice, but about the fundamental truth that every human being deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, economic status, or perceived social position. The worn cardigan and modest shoes that had marked her as unworthy in Morrison's eyes had concealed not just professional authority but the deeper truth that worth cannot be measured by external appearances, and that the elderly woman counting coins for her granddaughter's medicine possessed the same inherent dignity as the executive in the tailored suit purchasing expensive supplements. Through her experience, Margaret had learned that true power lies not in wielding authority to punish those who wrong us, but in using influence to create systematic change that protects others from experiencing the same cruelty and discrimination that we ourselves have endured. The transformation of Morrison from an arrogant gatekeeper to a compassionate healthcare advocate proved that even those who cause harm can find redemption through genuine self-reflection and dedicated service to others, while the courage of employees like Jessica demonstrated that speaking truth to power, despite personal risk, can catalyze positive change that extends far beyond individual circumstances. Margaret's story reminds us that in our daily interactions with others, we never truly know who we are encountering, what struggles they are facing, or what wisdom and experience they carry beneath their humble exterior, and that treating every person with kindness and respect is not just a moral imperative, but a practical wisdom that enriches our communities and our own lives. The elderly customer struggling with payment at the pharmacy counter might be a retired teacher who shaped generations of young minds. The quietly dressed woman in the waiting room could be a former CEO with decades of leadership experience, or the hesitant young person asking for help might become tomorrow's innovative healthcare provider who revolutionizes patient care. If this story resonates with your own experiences of being judged by appearances or witnessing unexpected kindness in difficult moments, share your story with others. Because every act of dignity and respect creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate interaction. Building a more compassionate world where healthcare access, basic services, and human dignity are available to all people, regardless of how the world chooses to see them. Remember that the next time you encounter someone who looks different, speaks differently, or struggles with payment, you have the power to choose compassion over judgment, understanding over dismissal, and kindness over cruelty. Because in that moment, you become part of the solution that creates a world where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve, simply by virtue of being human.